3 days before her wedding, Lady Seraphine Voss was standing in front of a mirror the size of a door, wearing a gown that had taken 11 seamstresses 4 months to finish, when the doors of her chamber burst open without a knock. It was Crown Prince Cassian Ardain, not smiling, not apologizing, not even looking at her directly. He looked at the mirror instead, as if it were easier to end 5 years of engagement by talking to her reflection than to her face. "The wedding is cancelled," he said. "I'm marrying Lady Ophelia." Seraphine did not scream, she did not cry. She asked one question quietly, the kind of quiet that unsettles a room more than shouting ever could. "Does my father know yet, or am I the first to hear that House Voss has been thrown away?" The prince had no answer for that. Within a day, the entire capital of Thessaly knew her name, not as the woman who would be empress, but as the woman who had been discarded like a used contract 3 days before the altar. What no one in that glittering, gossiping city expected was what would happen 1 week later, when the empire's most feared general, a man who had never bowed to a single noble house, walked into the ruins of her father's court and asked for her hand, not out of pity, but because he had just discovered exactly why the prince really left her, and it had nothing to do with love. The gown Seraphine wore that evening was ivory silk threaded with silver, designed to catch candlelight the way frost catches morning sun. She had chosen the fabric herself 8 months earlier, sitting beside her mother's portrait because her mother was no longer alive to sit beside her in person. Every stitch in that dress carried a small, private hope that this marriage, arranged since she was 12, might someday become something more than politics. She had never loved Prince Cassian the way songs describe love, but she had respected the promise. In the Ardain Empire, a promise from House Voss was worth more than gold, because House Voss had never broken one in 300 years. That was precisely why what happened next cut so deep. Cassian stood in the doorway with his ceremonial coat half-buttoned, his golden hair uncombed, the smell of another woman's perfume clinging faintly to his collar. Seraphine noticed it before she noticed his words, jasmine and orange blossom, a scent she had never worn, a scent that did not belong to House Voss at all. Her maid Nell froze near the wardrobe with a pin still between her fingers. Even the candle flame seemed to hold still. "Say it again," Seraphine said, turning from the mirror at last. "Say it to my face, not to the glass." Cassian's jaw tightened. He was a prince who had been trained since birth to command armies with a glance. Yet in that room, facing one woman in an unfinished wedding gown, he could not hold her eyes for more than a breath. "The council has decided that an alliance with House Reynard serves the empire better right now. Lady Ophelia's family controls the southern grain routes. Yours," he stopped himself, "but not soon enough. Mine no longer controls anything you need," Seraphine finished for him. "Say the rest, Cassian." "My father lost the northern trade contracts to the Reynards 2 months ago. This isn't the council's decision. This is convenience wearing a crown." He didn't deny it. That silence was its own confession, and it landed harder than any shout could have. Seraphine had spent 5 years learning to read rooms the way generals read maps, where the danger was, where the escape routes lay, which smile in court hid a knife behind it. She had not once, not for a single day, imagined that the danger would walk through her own bedroom door wearing the face of the man she was supposed to marry in 72 hours. "Get out," she said, and her voice did not shake. "If you're going to throw away 300 years of loyalty for a grain route, you can at least have the decency to do it without an audience of my staff watching you fumble the words." Cassian left. He did not apologize. He did not look back. And that, more than anything he said, told Seraphine everything she needed to know about the 5 years she had spent believing in him. By morning, the story had already traveled beyond the palace walls. Servants talk, and servants talk fastest when a scandal involves a prince. By noon, it had reached the merchant district. By evening, 3 separate playwrights were reportedly drafting satirical operettas about the duke's daughter who was left standing in her own gown. Thessaly loved nothing more than watching the mighty fall, and Seraphine Voss, daughter of one of the empire's oldest and proudest houses, had just become the season's favorite tragedy. Her father, Duke Aldrich Voss, arrived at her chamber within the hour, his face the color of old ash. He was a man who had survived 3 wars and 2 assassination attempts without losing his composure. But when he saw his daughter sitting perfectly still at her writing desk, staring at nothing, something in him cracked audibly, like a beam giving way in an old house. "I will go to the palace," he said. "I will demand—" "You will demand nothing," Seraphine interrupted, and for the first time that night her voice trembled not from weakness, but from the effort of holding back a fury so large it frightened even her. "Demanding anything from a throne that has already decided we are worthless will only prove to them that we are exactly as desperate as they think we are. We will not beg, father. Voss has never begged." But privately, alone in the dark hours before dawn, Seraphine allowed herself exactly 1 hour to grieve not the prince, whom she realized she had never truly loved, but the version of her life she had built around him. The wedding she'd never have. The children she'd imagined. The 5 years that now felt like a story someone else had written badly. At the end of that hour, she washed her face, and she made herself a promise instead of a wish. She would survive this humiliation in a way that made the entire capital regret laughing. She had no idea that night that survival would arrive at her door 1 week later, in the shape of a man the empire called the Butcher of Vera Pass. A general so feared that soldiers said his name the way children say the names of monsters under the bed. She had met General Kael Draven exactly twice in her life, both times at formal court functions where he had said fewer than 10 words total. She remembered him as a wall of a man wrapped in a black wolf fur cloak, scarred down one side of his jaw, who had watched the entire glittering court with the flat, assessing eyes of a soldier counting exits in a burning building. She did not yet know that Kael Draven had already begun asking quiet, dangerous questions about why House Reynard had suddenly acquired the northern trade contracts that used to belong to House Voss, and about who exactly had engineered the coincidence that a war hero's grain shortage in the capital's garrison had lined up perfectly with the timing of Cassian's broken engagement. Some men send flowers when a woman is wronged. Kael Draven sent for records. And what those records revealed would put House Reynard, and possibly the crown itself, on a collision course they were not prepared for. 3 days after the broken engagement, the Voss estate had gone quiet in the particular way a house goes quiet after a death. Visitors stopped calling. Invitations stopped arriving, and the servants who remained loyal did their work with the hushed, careful movements of people walking through a room where something fragile has just shattered. Duke Aldrich Voss sat in his study staring at a ledger that told a story worse than gossip ever could. 3 trade contracts cancelled in the same week, 2 merchant partnerships postponed indefinitely, and a formal notice from the Crown's treasury requesting an accelerated repayment schedule on a loan the House had taken out 2 winters ago to help fund the Empire's border defense. Individually, each event could be explained as unfortunate timing. Together, they read like a coordinated dismantling. They are not just ending a marriage, the Duke murmured to himself. They are ending us. He was not wrong. What he did not yet know was who had noticed the same pattern before he had. General Kael Draven did not attend court functions if he could avoid them. He found the perfumed air, the practiced laughter, and the endless maneuvering exhausting in a way that 3 years on the Northern Front had never managed to be. War, at least, was honest about what it wanted. Court rarely was, but 2 nights after the scandal broke. He attended a war council dinner at the palace, and it was there over a plate of food he barely touched that he first heard Lady Ophelia Reynard laugh, a bright, satisfied laugh. Aimed at her cousin across the table and say the words that would change the direction of everything. Honestly, it was almost too easy. Father simply had to remind the Treasury that House Voss's northern loan was due for review, and suddenly the council found House Voss less strategically valuable than us. Cassian didn't even need much convincing once he saw the numbers. Her cousin laughed along. Neither of them noticed the general 3 seats down, a man notorious for saying almost nothing, who had gone very, very still. Kael Draven had built his entire reputation on one skill above all others, noticing what people assumed he wasn't paying attention to. On the battlefield, that skill had saved entire regiments, reading a feint before it was fully committed to, spotting the one unit out of position that meant an ambush was coming. In court, that same instinct had simply been pointed at a different kind of battlefield, and what he had just heard was not idle gossip. It was a confession. House Reynard had manufactured a financial crisis to force the crown's hand. And Prince Cassian, either through weakness or willful blindness, had let himself be used as the instrument of another family's ambition. Kael excused himself early. He did not confront anyone at the dinner. That was not his way. Soldiers who charged before they understood the terrain died first, and he had buried too many good men who'd made that mistake to make it himself now, in a fight that mattered just as much even if no swords were drawn. Instead, he returned to his private quarters within the garrison and spent the night going through correspondence he had quietly acquired over the years, favors owed to him by clerks' treasury officials, and merchants who remembered a general who had personally ridden 3 days out of his way once to make sure a wounded supply line worker's family was paid what they were owed. By dawn, he had assembled enough of the picture to be certain. House Reynard's sudden wealth in the northern trade routes did not come from legitimate expansion. It came from underpaying tariffs through a loophole quietly arranged with a treasury official who had been gifted, a country estate 6 months prior. And the timing of House Voss's loan review had been deliberately accelerated by the same official at House Reynard's request 2 weeks before the wedding was ever cancelled. It wasn't fate that had ended Seraphine Voss's engagement. It was a plan, and she had been the price of it. Kael Draven was not a sentimental man. He did not believe in rescuing people for the sake of romance, and he had turned down 3 separate marriage proposals from noble families over the years, each one a thinly veiled attempt to attach themselves to his battlefield glory. But he did believe, with the same unshakable certainty he brought to every strategic decision, in correcting an unjust outcome when he had the power to do so, and in denying his enemies whatever they had schemed to gain. House Reynard wanted the Voss trade routes, the Voss influence, and now, apparently, the Voss reputation in ruins to make sure no one questioned how conveniently it had all worked out. Kael intended to give them none of it. He requested an audience with Duke Aldrich Voss the very next morning, a request so unusual, coming from a man who almost never sought out noble houses socially, that the Duke's steward had to ask him to repeat himself twice before believing it. When Kael Draven arrived at the Voss estate, he did not bring flowers or gifts, or the practice compliments court had taught every other man of rank to offer. He brought a folder of documents, laid them on the Duke's desk without ceremony, and said the words that would upend the capital's assumptions about how this scandal was supposed to end. Your daughter was not discarded because House Voss failed to be valuable enough, Your Grace. She was discarded because someone made very sure the Crown would believe that lie. I intend to make sure the Crown learns the truth, and I intend to marry your daughter to do it properly, if she will have me. The Duke stared at him in stunned silence for nearly a full minute. Neither man yet knew that Seraphine had been standing just outside the study door the entire time, one hand pressed flat against the wall, listening to a stranger offer to marry her not out of pity, or love or convenience, but as a declaration of war against the people who had humiliated her. And for the first time in 3 days, something in her chest that had felt frozen since the moment Cassian walked into her chamber began, cautiously, to move again. Seraphine did not announce herself immediately. She stood in the corridor outside her father's study, heart beating in a way that felt almost violent, replaying the general's words in her mind. I intend to marry your daughter to do it properly, if she will have me. Not if it pleases her, not if the arrangement suits House Voss, if she will have him, as though her answer mattered as much as her father's or the treaty or the scandal itself. No man had ever framed a proposal to her that way, not even Cassian, whose engagement to her had been settled entirely between their fathers when she was 12 years old, with her opinion consulted approximately never. She pushed the door open. Both men turned. Her father looked as though he'd been caught mid-thought and hadn't yet decided what to feel. General Draven simply looked at her, not with pity, not with the cautious, sideways glances the rest of the capital had been giving her all week, as if her humiliation might be contagious, but with the same flat, assessing attention she remembered from the 2 times they'd previously met. He was measuring her, she realized, not her beauty, not her bloodline, her, you heard, he said, it wasn't a question. Enough of it, Seraphine answered, stepping fully into the room. Up close, he was even larger than she remembered, not simply tall, but built like a man who had spent a decade doing things that required strength rather than elegance. A thin white scar ran from his left cheekbone down into his collar, souvenir of some battle no court gossip had ever managed to fully explain. His eyes were a dark, steady gray, the color of a sky before snow. Then you know I am not offering this out of kindness, he said. I don't have much use for kindness as a motive. It gets good soldiers killed when they mistake it for strategy. He gestured at the folder still open on the Duke's desk. House Reynard engineered your broken engagement to seize your family's trade routes and discredit your name so no one would ask questions when they took them. Your prince was either too foolish to notice or too convenient to care. Either way, I intend to expose it, and marrying you accomplishes 2 things I want. It denies Reynard the clean victory they engineered, and it puts someone in a position of real influence next to the throne who I know isn't compromised. Seraphine felt something in her chest tighten, not offense exactly, though a smaller, more foolish part of her had perhaps hoped, even now, for softer words. But there was something almost bracing about his bluntness, after 5 years of a prince who dressed every convenient decision in the language of duty and love. You want a political weapon, she said slowly, testing the shape of the idea aloud. And you're offering me your name in exchange for using it as one. I'm offering you my name because it is currently the one name in this empire that Reynard, and the crown itself, cannot afford to attack without consequence, Kael said. No one moves against the general who broke the siege at Vera Pass without the army noticing. And the army is the one thing even a corrupt council fears losing the loyalty of. Marry Me and Reynard's scheme collapses the moment it becomes public, because they will have humiliated House Voss for nothing. You will not be a discarded fiancé anymore. You will be my wife, and by extension, untouchable in every hall that matters. It was, Seraphine thought, possibly the least romantic proposal ever delivered inside the borders of the Ardain Empire. And yet there was something in it that felt more honest than every soft, practiced word Cassian had ever given her. Kael Draven was not pretending this was about love. He was offering her a partnership built on shared enemies and mutual advantage, and somehow that honesty landed like water on a burn, painful in its bluntness, but exactly what the wound needed. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then I will still expose House Reynard's fraud, because it's the right thing to do and because I don't like being lied to by people who think soldiers are too simple to read a ledger," Kael said. "You lose nothing by refusing except the chance to be the one holding the knife when it happens, instead of watching from the sidelines while men decide your fate for you again." Duke Aldrich, who had remained silent through this entire exchange, finally spoke. "Seraphine, this is your choice. I will not pretend the alliance wouldn't save this house, but I have already watched one man treat your future as a bargaining chip this week. I won't be the second." Seraphine looked between the two men, her father, hollowed out by a scandal not of his making, and the general who stood in the middle of her ruined engagement, offering her not comfort but power and the chance to hold her own knife for once instead of being cut by everyone else. She thought of the mirror, of the gown, of Cassian's eyes sliding away from hers as he ended 5 years without so much as a proper apology. She thought of the whispered laughter she had already heard drifting from open windows as her carriage passed through the capital that morning, nobles who did not bother lowering their voices, certain that the discarded Lady Voss no longer mattered enough to overhear them. She was tired, desperately bone-deep tired of being a woman that things happened to. "If I marry you," she said, meeting the general's gray eyes directly, "I am not doing it to be rescued, General Draven. I want that understood before either of us says another word. I will be your partner in this, not your prize." For the first time since he'd entered the room, something shifted in Kael Draven's expression, not quite a smile, but a loosening, the faint and reluctant respect of a soldier recognizing another soldier's spine. "Good," he said. "I have no use for a wife who expects to be carried. I need one who can hold a line." Neither of them noticed in that moment the shadow that slipped away from the study's outer window, a household spy in House Reynard's employ, who had been watching the Voss estate all week for signs of exactly this kind of dangerous alliance, and who now had very urgent news to deliver to his mistress before the sun set. Lady Ophelia Reynard was about to learn that the humiliation she had engineered for Seraphine Voss had just handed her enemy the one weapon in the entire empire that Ophelia's family could not buy, threaten, or outmaneuver. Lady Ophelia Reynard had spent the 3 days since Cassian's announcement luxuriating in a victory that had taken over a year to engineer. She had watched Seraphine Voss's gown fitted for a wedding that would never happen. Watched the invitations printed with the wrong bride's name still on them, because the palace had been too slow to reprint, and had allowed herself in the privacy of her chambers several very satisfied smiles at her own reflection. The spy's report arrived just after supper, and it wiped every trace of that satisfaction from her face within the first sentence. General Draven proposed to her. Ophelia's voice cracked upward, unbecoming of a lady who prided herself on composure. "That's impossible. He's turned down 3 proposals already from families with twice our influence." "He wasn't proposing for influence, my lady," the spy said carefully, sensing the danger of delivering bad news to a woman known for having servants dismissed over far smaller failures. "From what could be overheard, he has documents, financial records connecting your family's new trade contracts to a bribed treasury official, and the accelerated loan review that forced House Voss's hand." The color drained from Ophelia's face. Her father, Lord Bertrand Reynard, had assured her the scheme was airtight, a series of small, deniable favors that would never trace back cleanly to their family. She had believed him because she wanted desperately to believe that the life she had spent years angling for, a crown, a throne, the title of empress that should have belonged to a lesser house than Voss, was finally rightfully close enough to touch. "Get my father," she said. Now, Lord Bertrand arrived within the hour, his usually unshakable composure fraying at the edges as his daughter relayed what the spy had reported. "Draven doesn't bluff," he said grimly, pacing before the fireplace. "If he says he has records, he has records. That man has spent a decade building a network of favors more reliable than half the Crown's own intelligence service. We need to move before he can present anything publicly." "Move how?" Ophelia demanded. We can't simply have him killed, the army would riot. Half of them would follow that man off a cliff if he asked them to. No, her father agreed, but we can discredit the source. If Draven's evidence looks like the desperate fabrication of a bitter, disgraced house trying to reclaim relevance through slander, the council will dismiss it before they even finish reading it. We simply need the narrative to arrive first and loudly. By the following morning, whispers had begun circulating through the capital's most fashionable salons that Duke Voss, humiliated by his daughter's broken engagement, had approached General Draven not out of any genuine connection, but out of desperate financial necessity, offering a rushed marriage in exchange for the general's protection against mounting debts. The whispers painted Seraphine not as a wronged woman, but as a calculating opportunist, chasing a second, more powerful match the moment the first one collapsed. It was, Seraphine realized with a cold, clarifying fury when the rumors reached her, almost impressively fast work. Ophelia Reynard did not fight with swords. She fought with narrative, and she fought quickly. They're trying to make it look like I proposed to you, Kael observed dryly, when he arrived at the Voss estate that afternoon to find Seraphine reading 3 separate gossip pamphlets with an expression that could curdle milk. Out of financial desperation, no less. As though House Voss's entire fortune has evaporated in 3 days. It's clever, Seraphine admitted, setting the pamphlets down with more force than necessary. If the capital believes I chased you for security rather than being chosen for the reasons you actually gave, it undermines everything, your credibility for exposing them and mine for accepting. It makes us both look desperate instead of dangerous. Kael studied her for a long moment. You understand the game faster than most officers I've trained. I've been playing it since I was 12 years old, General. I simply didn't realize until this week how badly I was losing. She stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that had finally stopped trembling sometime in the last 2 days. We can't let them control the story any longer. We need to announce our engagement publicly, on our own terms, before Ophelia Reynard writes the rest of the narrative for us. I agree, but an announcement alone won't be enough to silence 3 days of manufactured gossip. Kael crossed to the window, looking out over the Voss gardens, already beginning to lose their color as autumn crept toward the capital. We need something undeniable. Something they can't spin into a rumor. The financial records, Seraphine said immediately. Not yet. Kael shook his head. If we reveal everything at once, Reynard will have time to scramble a defense, bribe a magistrate, bury the paper trail deeper. We need to announce the engagement first, publicly, formally, at a setting large enough that the capital cannot pretend not to notice, and let Reynard believe they've successfully painted us as desperate. Let them grow confident. Confident people make mistakes. Seraphine felt something sharpen inside her. A feeling she hadn't experienced since long before Cassian's betrayal, the particular electric focus of someone who has stopped merely surviving a crisis and started actively hunting the people who caused it. You want to bait them, she said. I want to win, Kael corrected. Baiting them is simply how we get there. 3 days later, an engagement announcement was read aloud in the Grand Assembly Hall of Thessaly, before nearly every noble house in the capital, by General Kael Draven himself, a man who had not addressed a civilian assembly in over 6 years. He stood beside Lady Seraphine Voss, whose chin was lifted in a way that photographs and paintings of the moment would later describe as unbroken, and delivered a short, unflinching statement that gave House Reynard's rumors nowhere left to hide. I am aware of the stories currently circulating about the nature of this engagement, he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast hall without need of amplification. I would like to correct them personally, so there is no confusion later about who said what. I did not propose to Lady Voss out of pity or convenience, or because House Voss required rescuing. I proposed because in the course of investigating certain recent trade irregularities, I discovered evidence of financial fraud that directly cost House Voss its standing, and I intend to make that evidence public, in full, before the Imperial Council within the fortnight. A ripple of shocked silence spread through the hall, followed almost immediately by a rising, uncontainable murmur. Lord Bertrand Reynard, standing near the front with his daughter, felt the blood leave his face for the second time in 3 days. The trap Kael Draven had set was no longer subtle. It was a declaration of war, delivered in front of the entire capital, and now House Reynard had exactly 14 days to either destroy the general's evidence or watch everything they had built collapse in front of the Empire's throne. 14 days. Ophelia Reynard repeated the number to herself until it stopped sounding like a threat and started sounding like a puzzle to be solved. Because panic, she had learned long ago, accomplished nothing that careful planning couldn't do better. He announced it publicly to force our hand. Her father said that night, once the household had gone quiet and only the two of them remained in his study, candles burned low. If we move against him quietly, it will look exactly like what it is, an attempt to silence the accusation which only confirms it's true. He's cornered us into a position where our own defense will look like guilt. Then we don't defend, Ophelia said slowly. We attack the evidence itself, not the announcement. If the documents he has were obtained improperly, stolen correspondence, bribed clerks giving unauthorized access to sealed treasury files, then it doesn't matter what they show. The council can dismiss the entire matter on procedural grounds without ever needing to argue the numbers. Lord Bertrand considered this, a slow, calculating respect crossing his features. His daughter had inherited more of his instincts than he'd given her credit for. You want to make it about how he got the evidence, not what the evidence says. Exactly. And if we can also demonstrate that General Draven has a personal financial motive of his own, some benefit to himself in seeing our family's contracts revoked, the council will read the entire matter as a rival house's power grab dressed up as justice. Ophelia's mind was already racing ahead, assembling pieces. We need someone inside the Treasury office willing to testify that the documents were obtained without proper authorization. Clerk Havern owes us. He's the one who arranged the loan review timing in the first place. But what neither Reynard fully understood, what they could not have known sequestered as they were within the self-reinforcing certainty of their own scheme, was that Kael Draven had anticipated precisely this countermove. Because he had watched enemies deploy the exact same tactic on the battlefield 100 times before. When you cannot defeat the truth, attack its source. When you cannot deny the crime, question the method of its discovery. They'll go after Havern, Kael told Seraphine 2 days after the announcement. As they sat together in the Voss estate's private study, maps and documents spread between them like a war room, which, in every meaningful sense it now was. Either bribing him to recant his cooperation or threatening him into silence. We need him protected, and we need a second, independent source confirming the same fraud so the case doesn't collapse if he's compromised. You think that quickly, Seraphine said, watching him work through the problem with the same economy of motion she imagined he brought to actual military campaigns. No wasted words, no wasted gestures, every consideration weighed and discarded or kept within seconds. Do you approach every problem like a siege? Every problem worth solving is a siege of one kind or another, Kael replied without looking up from the documents. You identify the objective, you identify what's defending it, you find the weakest point in that defense, and you commit resources there instead of wasting them attacking strength. And what's the weakest point in House Reynard's defense? Kael finally looked up, and there was something almost like amusement in the flat gray of his eyes, the first hint of humor she had seen from him since they'd met. Pride. Ophelia Reynard didn't orchestrate this scheme for money alone. Her family already has considerable wealth. She wanted the throne badly enough to destroy your engagement to get it. A woman who wants something that badly rarely stops at one scheme when the first begins to fail. She'll overreach trying to save it. He was right, though neither of them yet knew how quickly or how catastrophically that overreach would arrive. Within 4 days, Clerk Havern, the Treasury official whose testimony was meant to anchor the fraud case, vanished from his residence in the capital's administrative quarter. His neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar carriage outside his home late one evening. By morning, his rooms were empty, his belongings hastily packed, and a note left for his landlord claiming he had accepted a position in the provinces with no further explanation. Seraphine received the news with cold fury. They've bought his silence, or worse. Or worse, Kael agreed grimly, already reaching for his coat. I have people watching the roads north and east. If they've moved him rather than simply paid him off, we may still be able to find him before he's silenced permanently. Reynard cannot afford witnesses who might change their minds later, which means if this is more than a bribe, we have very little time. It was Seraphine, not Kael, who found the crucial clue that broke the case open. A detail so small that it had escaped the general's usually meticulous attention, entirely buried not in the financial records, but in something far more mundane. The household staffing logs of the Reynard estate which Seraphine, through a former lady's maid who had once served House Voss before being let go during the family's financial troubles, and quietly rehired by House Reynard, was able to obtain. 3 days before Clerk Havern's disappearance, the log showed a new traveling companion had been added to the household payroll, hired ostensibly to accompany Lord Bertrand on an upcoming trip to the southern provinces. The companion's name was recorded as Peter Voss, not Voss by coincidence. Voss by a cruel, deliberate joke. a former groundskeeper dismissed from House Voss's staff 2 years prior after a dispute over wages, a man with a documented grudge. Now suddenly employed by House Reynard at the exact moment they needed someone willing to escort an inconvenient witness quietly out of the capital. They're using him to make it look connected to us, Seraphine breathed, staring at the name on the page. If anyone finds Havern missing and traces it back to a man surnamed Voss, it muddies the entire narrative. It makes it look like we silenced him to fabricate our own case. Kael's expression had gone very still, the particular dangerous stillness Seraphine was beginning to recognize as the moment before he committed fully to a course of action. Then we find Havern before Reynard can complete whatever they're planning, he said. And we make sure the entire capital knows exactly who hired the man wearing your family's name to do it. Neither of them slept that night. By dawn, riders were already moving along every road leading out of Thessaly, searching for a missing clerk whose testimony now stood between House Reynard's scheme succeeding completely, and the entire fraud unraveling in front of the Imperial Council in exactly 11 days. The search for Clerk Havern consumed the better part of 3 days, and it was during those 3 days, riding alongside Kael Draven's most trusted soldiers along muddy northern roads, sleeping in modest inns instead of palace guest chambers, sharing rationed meals instead of 7-course dinners, that Seraphine began to understand the general in a way the glittering halls of Thessaly never could have shown her. He was not, she discovered, a cold man. He was a careful one, which the capital had mistaken for coldness because carefulness rarely photographed as charmingly as easy laughter. He remembered the names of every soldier under his command, asked after a corporal's newborn daughter by name, and personally checked that the horses were properly tended before allowing himself to eat each evening, small habits that spoke of a man who had learned somewhere in years of war that the difference between a functioning unit and a broken one often came down to whether its leader noticed the small things. You don't have to do this yourself, Seraphine said on the second night. Watching him examine a map by lamplight in the corner of a cramped roadside, in having spent the last hour personally interviewing a stable boy who claimed to have seen a carriage matching their description pass through 2 days prior. You have soldiers for this, officers. People whose entire job is chasing down leads. I do, Kael agreed, not looking up from the map. But if I ask a man to do something I'm unwilling to do myself, I've already lost the right to lead him into anything harder than this. He glanced at her briefly. Besides, this concerns your family's name. I'd rather find the truth myself than trust it to someone else's report. It was a small thing to say, but it settled into Seraphine's chest with unexpected weight. Cassian, in 5 years of engagement, had never once involved himself personally in anything that concerned House Voss beyond the ceremonial. He had sent representatives to her father's business dealings, delegated every difficult conversation, and treated the entire relationship as an item on a schedule rather than a responsibility he carried himself. Kael Draven, a man she had known for barely 2 weeks, was riding through mud and rain personally, because he considered her family's reputation something worth his own effort rather than someone else's. They found Clerk Havern on the 3rd day, in a rented room above a tavern in a small trading town 2 days' ride from the capital, alive, frightened, and as it turned out, considerably more useful than House Reynard had anticipated when they'd arranged to move him. Peter Voss, the disgraced former groundskeeper hired to escort him, had grown careless with drink over the 2 nights of travel, and had said considerably more than he should have about who was paying him and why. They told me I'd be paid double if I made sure he didn't talk to anyone before reaching the border, Havern admitted, hands shaking around a cup of watered wine as Kael and Seraphine sat across from him in the tavern's back room. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. They made it clear my family would suffer if I refused to cooperate, and then suffer worse if I talked. You're safe now, Seraphine said, and meant it, a promise. Kael's presence, and the 6 armed soldiers stationed outside, made considerably easier to keep than it would have been a week earlier. But we need your testimony. The original testimony about the accelerated loan review and Lord Reynard's involvement in arranging it. Havern hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door, as though Bertrand Reynard's influence might materialize through solid wood. If I testify formally, publicly, my family will be protected under my direct authority, Kael said, and something in the flat certainty of his voice seemed to steady the trembling clerk more than any softer reassurance could have. I do not make promises I cannot keep, Clerk Havern. You have my word, and my word has held on battlefields where lying would have gotten men killed. It will hold for you. It was enough. Havern agreed to return to the capital and testify, But Peter Voss, when confronted by Kael's soldiers the following morning, proved far less cooperative, attempting to flee into the surrounding woods rather than face questioning. He was caught within the hour, and under considerably firmer interrogation, admitted the full scope of his arrangement with House Reynard. He had been paid not merely to escort Havern out of the capital, but to ensure, if necessary, that the clerk never reached his destination at all. Seraphine felt the blood drain from her face as the confession was relayed to her. They were going to have him killed, and frame it eventually to look connected to your family's name, Kael said grimly. It would have been the final piece, a missing witness, murdered, with a man surnamed Voss as the last person seen with him. It would have destroyed whatever remained of your family's credibility permanently, regardless of what the financial records showed. The full weight of what House Reynard had been willing to do, not merely to secure a throne, but to erase every possible obstacle in the process, including a man's life, settled over Seraphine with a cold, clarifying finality. This was no longer simply about a broken engagement, or wounded pride, or even her family's trade routes. This was about stopping people willing to kill in order to sit on a throne they had no rightful claim to. "We ride back to the capital today," Kael said, already moving toward the door, his expression set with the particular grim focus Seraphine now recognized as his battlefield face. "We have 8 days left before the council hearing. That's no longer enough time to be cautious. It's enough time to be thorough, and we will be." What neither of them yet knew as they set out on the 2-day ride back toward Thessaly with Havern and a bound, furious Peter Voss in tow, was that Prince Cassian, who had spent the last 2 weeks in a fog of denial about the true circumstances of his broken engagement, had just begun independently to ask his own uncomfortable questions about Lady Ophelia's family. Questions that would either save him from being complicit in a conspiracy to murder or implicate him in it entirely. Prince Cassian Ardain had told himself, in the 2 weeks since ending his engagement to Seraphine Voss, that he had made a difficult but necessary political decision. The empire needed strong trade alliances. The council had presented compelling arguments. Lady Ophelia was charming, ambitious, and he'd allowed himself to believe in the comfortable fog of self-justification, probably better suited to the demands of ruling than a quieter, more reserved woman he had grown fond of but never quite loved the way songs described. It was a story he told himself well enough to sleep at night, until General Draven's public announcement in the Grand Assembly Hall cracked the first hairline fracture through it. Financial fraud that directly cost House Voss its standing. The words had lodged in Cassian's mind like a splinter he couldn't quite work free. He had told himself, in the days following the announcement, that Draven was simply protecting his new fiancée's reputation, perhaps exaggerating circumstances to justify a hasty marriage. But princes, whatever their other flaws, are trained from childhood to recognize the particular weight of a man who does not bluff. And Kael Draven had never, in Cassian's admittedly limited dealings with him, been a man prone to exaggeration. So Cassian did something he had not done in the 2 weeks since the scandal broke. He actually looked at the numbers himself, rather than trusting the council's summarized briefings. What he found unsettled him considerably more than he expected. The timeline, laid out plainly in the Treasury's own records, showed House Voss's loan review accelerated by nearly 4 months from its scheduled date, an irregularity that on its own might have been dismissed as administrative oversight. But cross-referenced against House Reynard's newly acquired trade contracts, granted within the same 3-week window, the pattern was difficult to explain away as coincidence, even for a man deeply invested in believing otherwise. "I need to speak with Lord Bertrand," Cassian told his private secretary that evening, unable to shake the growing unease settling in his chest. "Quietly, tonight if possible." The conversation, when it finally happened in Lord Bertrand's private study, did nothing to ease Cassian's concerns. If anything, it confirmed them in the worst possible way. Bertrand Reynard, caught off guard by the prince's direct questions and unprepared for genuine scrutiny after weeks of successfully managing court gossip, grew defensive in a manner that revealed considerably more than his careful words attempted to conceal. "Your Highness, surely you're not suggesting my family orchestrated House Voss's misfortune purely to benefit our own position," Bertrand said, a thin, brittle smile failing to fully mask the tension in his voice. "These are simply the ordinary fluctuations of trade and finance. Fortune favors some houses over others. It has always been thus. Then you won't object to the council reviewing the full timeline of the Treasury's decisions alongside your acquisition of those contracts," Cassian pressed, watching the older man's composure fray a fraction further. "If it's simply fortune, as you say, a thorough review should confirm exactly that. and put the matter to rest entirely. Bertrand's hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was more than enough for a prince trained since birth to read exactly this kind of silence. "I see," Cassian said quietly, and something cold and sick settled in his stomach, a feeling considerably worse than the guilt he'd been nursing over ending his engagement badly. If Draven's accusations held merit, if House Reynard had genuinely engineered House Voss's downfall through fraud, then Cassian himself had been not merely careless in ending his engagement poorly, but an unwitting instrument in a scheme to destroy an entirely innocent house for another family's political ambition. He had broken Seraphine's heart, humiliated her before the entire capital, and thrown away 5 years of loyalty from a house that had done nothing to deserve it. All because he had been too eager to believe a convenient story that flattered his own desires. Rather than questioning why that story had arrived so perfectly timed, Cassian left the Reynard estate that night with considerably more clarity than he'd arrived with, and considerably less peace. He arrived unannounced at the Voss estate 2 days later. The same afternoon Kael Draven and Seraphine returned from the northern road with Clerk Havern's testimony secured. The timing, though neither party had planned it, could not have been more dramatically precise. Seraphine, exhausted from 2 days of hard travel, dust still clinging to her riding clothes, found herself facing the man who had ended their engagement in her chamber mirror 3 weeks earlier. Except now he stood in her father's entrance hall looking considerably less like a prince and considerably more like a man forced finally to reckon with the consequences of his own convenient blindness. "I know what House Reynard did," Cassian said without preamble before she could speak, before her father's steward could even properly announce him. "I've seen enough of the Treasury records myself to know it wasn't simple fortune that ended House Voss's trade contracts. I came to," he faltered, visibly searching for words that felt adequate to the scale of what he owed her and finding none. "I came to apologize, properly this time. Not through a representative, not through the council's language, to you directly the way I should have 3 weeks ago." Kael Draven, standing several paces behind Seraphine, made no move to intervene, watching, with the same careful assessment he brought to every unfolding situation to see how she would choose to respond. Seraphine studied the prince for a long moment, really studied him. The way she hadn't allowed herself to in 5 years of comfortable, unquestioning engagement, when she had simply accepted that this was what her future looked like, without ever truly examining the man standing at the center of it. "You're not here because you're sorry for hurting me, Cassian," she said finally, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only a tired, hard-won clarity. "You're here because you're afraid of what it means about your own judgment, that you let yourself be used so easily. Those are 2 very different apologies, and only one of them is actually about me." Cassian flinched because it was true and because he recognized in that moment that the woman standing in front of him, steady, unbroken, flanked by a general who had traveled 2 days through mud and rain to defend her family's honor personally rather than delegate it to anyone else, was no longer the quiet, patient fiancée he had spent 5 years taking for granted. "What can I do?" he asked, and it was, for perhaps the first time in his life, an entirely genuine question to help make this right. Seraphine glanced once at Kael, who gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that whatever came next, the choice belonged entirely to her. "You can testify before the council," she said, "about exactly what Lord Bertrand admitted to you. And you can do it publicly, in front of the entire capital, so that no one is ever again tempted to mistake this for a rumor started by a spurned house seeking revenge." It was, Seraphine realized as she said it, not an act of forgiveness. It was something considerably more useful, a weapon, and Cassian, guilt-ridden and finally clear-eyed, had just handed it to her willingly. The Grand Council Chamber of Thessaly had not seen a session this crowded in over a decade. Word had spread through the capital in the days leading up to the hearing that General Draven intended to formally present evidence of financial fraud against House Reynard, and that Prince Cassian himself, astonishingly, was expected to testify. Every noble house with any claim to relevance had secured a seat, and the public gallery, ordinarily reserved for minor clerks and petitioners, had been packed since before dawn with merchants, off-duty soldiers, and ordinary citizens of Thessaly who had followed the scandal through 3 weeks of increasingly feverish gossip. Seraphine sat beside her father in the section reserved for petitioning houses, wearing not the ivory wedding gown that had defined her humiliation 3 weeks earlier, but a deep, deliberate crimson, a color House Voss had not worn publicly in years, chosen specifically at Kael's quiet suggestion. Because red is not a color people associate with victims. Lord Bertrand and Lady Ophelia Reynard sat across the chamber, flanked by their own legal counsel, wearing expressions of carefully maintained composure that Seraphine, having spent 3 weeks learning to read exactly this kind of performance, recognized immediately as barely contained panic. The council chairman, an elderly statesman named Lord Halstead, who had presided over 4 decades of Thessaly's political disputes, called the session to order with a weary gravity that suggested he already sensed this hearing would be remembered for considerably longer than most. General Draven. You have requested this session to present evidence of financial fraud against House Reynard connected to the recent dissolution of the engagement between Crown Prince Cassian and Lady Seraphine Voss. The council will hear your presentation. Kael rose. He did not carry notes, did not fumble for words the way lesser orators might under the weight of the entire capital's attention. He simply began speaking with the same flat, economical clarity he brought to every battlefield briefing, laying out the timeline of events with methodical precision. The accelerated loan review, the Treasury clerk bribed to arrange it, the sudden acquisition of House Voss's northern trade contracts by House Reynard within the same 3-week window. He presented documents, verified by 3 independent Treasury auditors he had personally arranged in the preceding week to review the records without knowledge of who had commissioned the review, ensuring the council could not dismiss the findings as biased. This is character assassination dressed as testimony, Bertrand Reynard interrupted, rising from his seat, his composure finally beginning to fracture under the chamber's mounting silence. Coincidental timing is not proof of conspiracy, General. If this is the entirety of your evidence, I would suggest the council dismiss it as the desperate maneuvering of a house attempting to reclaim relevance through slander. It was, Seraphine noted, almost exactly the defense she and Kael had anticipated 2 weeks earlier, back in the war room of documents and maps spread across her father's study. Ophelia's earlier instinct, attack the method, not the substance, had clearly become the family's official strategy. Coincidental timing would be one thing, Lord Bertrand, Kael replied unhurried. But I have more than timing. He gestured, and a court attendant escorted Clerk Havern into the chamber, very much alive, considerably more composed than he'd been in that trembling tavern room 2 weeks earlier, and prepared. Finally to say the words he'd been too frightened to say publicly, until a general's personal protection made silence feel more dangerous than testimony. The chamber's murmur rose sharply the moment Havern's identity was announced. Several nobles had clearly assumed, based on rumors that had circulated in the preceding weeks, that the clerk had permanently disappeared or been quietly disposed of. Havern's testimony was methodical, detailed, and devastating. He described the specific conversation in which Lord Bertrand had requested the accelerated loan review the payment arranged in exchange for his cooperation. And in the testimony's most damning section, the attempted abduction and planned murder arranged by House Reynard once they realized he might testify against them, including the deliberate hiring of a man surnamed Voss to implicate an innocent house in the crime. Peter Voss, brought before the council in restraints, corroborated the account in full, having apparently decided, in the weeks since his capture, that self-preservation outweighed any remaining loyalty to the family that had hired him. Lady Ophelia's composure finally shattered entirely. This is absurd. You cannot possibly believe the confession of a disgraced groundskeeper over the word of Lady Ophelia. The voice that interrupted her belonged not to Kael, not to the council chairman, but to Prince Cassian, rising from his seat in a section of the chamber reserved for the crown, his expression grim and resolved in a way the capital had rarely seen from him. I would ask the council's indulgence to add my own testimony to this record. The chamber fell into a silence so complete that Seraphine could hear her own pulse. Cassian's testimony when it came was brief but unambiguous, a recounting of his private conversation with Lord Bertrand. The older man's telling hesitation when directly questioned, and Cassian's own dawning realization that his broken engagement to Lady Voss had been engineered rather than the product of genuine political necessity, by a family willing to manufacture a financial crisis to destroy an innocent house's standing. I was wrong to end my engagement the way I did, Cassian said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned chamber, and I was wrong to allow myself to be so easily convinced it was necessary. But I will not compound that failure by staying silent now, when silence would mean allowing an innocent family to remain publicly disgraced for a crime they did not commit, while the family that engineered their downfall escapes accountability entirely. Lord Halstead, the council chairman, allowed the chamber's uproar to run its course for nearly a full minute before finally calling for order, his gavel striking the podium with unusual force. In light of the evidence presented, financial records, independent auditor verification, direct testimony from a treasury clerk, corroborating testimony from an accomplice, and the Crown Prince's own account of Lord Bertrand's admission, this council finds sufficient grounds to formally charge House Reynard with financial fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Lord Bertrand Reynard and Lady Ophelia Reynard will be remanded to the Crown's custody pending formal trial. The guards who moved to escort the Reynards from the chamber found little resistance. Lord Bertrand had gone gray and silent, the calculating confidence that had carried him through weeks of careful maneuvering finally, completely extinguished. Ophelia, however, was not so easily silenced. "This isn't over," she hissed, as guards took her by both arms, her eyes locking onto Seraphine's across the crowded chamber with a fury sharpened by 3 weeks of a scheme unraveling in the worst possible way. "You think a marriage to a soldier makes you untouchable. You think this is justice. This is simply a different family with better timing." "No," Seraphine said, rising from her seat, and her voice, though quiet, carried with a clarity that silenced even the murmuring chamber around her. "This is what happens when you build a throne on someone else's ruin, Ophelia, and forget that ruins have a way of remembering exactly who built them." It was, Seraphine would later think, the closest thing to a true victory speech she would ever deliver, not loud, not triumphant in the way the capital's gossip pamphlets would inevitably describe it, but final, complete. The exact opposite of the humiliated silence she had carried out of her chamber 3 weeks earlier, when a prince had ended 5 years of loyalty by speaking to her reflection instead of her face. In the days following the council's ruling, the capital of Thessaly did what capitals always do in the aftermath of scandal. It talked, endlessly reshaping the story into whatever version best suited each teller's own vanity or grievance. But beneath the gossip, something more substantial had genuinely shifted. House Reynard's holdings were seized pending trial. Their trade contracts formally returned to House Voss, along with a public acknowledgement from the Crown of the fraud that had cost the family its standing. Duke Aldrich Voss, who had watched his house nearly dismantled over the course of 3 catastrophic weeks, found himself, somewhat disorientingly, receiving formal apologies from council members who had been all too willing to believe the worst of his family when it was politically convenient to do so. "It's a strange thing," the Duke admitted to Seraphine one evening, the two of them sharing a quiet dinner in the estate's smaller dining room, the grand hall still feeling to both of them faintly haunted by the memory of a wedding that never happened. "To watch people who wrote you off entirely suddenly remember your worth, the moment it becomes useful to do so. I've stopped needing their approval to know my own worth, father," Seraphine said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. "That's the part House Reynard never understood. They thought destroying my reputation would destroy me. It only clarified exactly which opinions were worth caring about and which weren't." Prince Cassian's role in the affair, meanwhile, occupied a considerably more complicated place in the capital's collective memory. His public testimony had been widely regarded as an act of genuine, if belated, integrity, a prince choosing accountability over self-protection, at real cost to his own reputation. But it had not and could not undo the damage of his initial decision, nor the 5 years of quiet complacency that had allowed him to be so easily manipulated in the first place. He visited the Voss estate one final time, roughly 2 weeks after the council hearing, not to apologize again. He seemed finally to understand that further apology had become its own kind of imposition, but simply to acknowledge plainly what the entire ordeal had taught him. "I used to think being a good ruler meant making decisions efficiently," he told Seraphine, as they walked together through the estate's gardens, autumn now fully settled over Thessaly in a haze of amber and rust-colored leaves. "I've learned, rather painfully, that efficiency without genuine scrutiny is simply a faster way to be wrong. I don't expect your forgiveness, Seraphine. I'm not sure I've entirely earned it, and I'm not sure it's mine to ask for any more. But I wanted you to know that whatever else came of this, I understand now exactly what I threw away, and it wasn't simply an engagement." Seraphine considered him for a long moment, this man she had once imagined spending her entire life beside, now standing before her as something closer to a stranger reshaped by consequence. "I don't hate you, Cassian," she said finally, and found the words once spoken carried none of the old ache she might have expected. "I think, for a long time I mistook comfort for love and duty for partnership. I'm grateful in a strange way that I learned the difference before it was too late to matter. I hope you learn it too in whatever comes next for you." It was perhaps as close to closure as either of them would ever find, not friendship, not lingering resentment, but a quiet mutual acknowledgement of a chapter genuinely closed, its lessons hard-won but real. Kael Draven's own transformation over those same weeks was quieter, less publicly dramatic, but no less significant to the small circle of people who knew him well enough to notice it. The general who had entered this arrangement with cold, strategic clarity, a marriage as weapon, a partnership as war strategy, found himself, somewhat to his own private bewilderment, genuinely reluctant to leave Seraphine's company each evening when military obligations called him back to the garrison. "You've gone quiet," Seraphine observed one evening, the two of them reviewing final preparations for their upcoming wedding, a considerably smaller, quieter affair than the elaborate ceremony that had been planned for her and Cassian, but one that felt, to Seraphine's genuine surprise, infinitely more real. "That's unusual even for you." "I'm recalibrating," Kael admitted, setting down the guest list he'd been reviewing with the same methodical attention he brought to troop deployments. "I propose to you as a strategic decision, Seraphine. I want you to know that hasn't changed. I don't regret the reasoning that brought us here. But somewhere in the last month, the reasoning stopped being the only thing keeping me in this room with you each evening." Seraphine felt something warm and unguarded rise in her chest, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to fully trust since Cassian's betrayal, but one that felt, in this moment, entirely different from anything she'd shared with the prince across 5 years of comfortable, unquestioning engagement. "Say what you mean, General," she said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. "You're usually considerably more direct than this." Kael huffed something that might, in a less disciplined man, have been called a laugh. "I mean that I intended to marry a capable political partner, and somewhere along the way, I find myself wanting to marry a woman I genuinely admire, and whose company I find myself reluctant to leave. If that's not clear enough for you, I'm willing to attempt a more traditional declaration, though I'll warn you now I have considerably more practice commanding armies than composing romantic speeches." Seraphine laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the first she could remember since long before the disastrous night her engagement had ended in her chamber mirror. "I think," she said, reaching for his hand across the table scattered with wedding preparations, "that was considerably more romantic than anything Cassian ever managed in 5 years, General, and you didn't even need the practice." Their wedding, held 3 weeks later in a considerably smaller ceremony than the one originally planned for the Grand Cathedral, was attended by a fraction of the capital's nobility. But every person present, Seraphine noted with quiet satisfaction, was there because they genuinely wished to witness the union, rather than out of political obligation. As she stood before Kael Draven in a simple deep crimson gown rather than the ivory silk that had once represented a future built on comfortable delusions, Seraphine found herself thinking with a clarity she hadn't possessed 3 months earlier. That being discarded before an altar had not been the tragedy the capital's gossip pamphlets had once painted it as. It had simply been the ending of a story that was never truly hers to begin with, clearing the way for one that was. But as the ceremony concluded, and the modest celebration began, a messenger arrived at the estate's gates bearing urgent news from the northern border, a word that would within days pull General Kael Draven back into a conflict, considerably larger and more dangerous than any court scandal, and test whether the partnership Seraphine and Kael had built over these tumultuous weeks could survive a war neither of them had seen coming. The messenger's news delivered with the particular breathless urgency of someone who had ridden through the night without rest. Was this, forces from the neighboring kingdom of Draveth sensing weakness, in the wake of the Empire's very public political scandal, had begun massing troops along the northern border, testing, it seemed, whether the chaos-consuming Thessaly's court had left the Empire's defenses distracted enough to exploit. Kael read the dispatch twice, his wedding finery still in place, the celebratory wine barely touched in his hand. "You have to go," Seraphine said, before he could voice the words himself, because she had spent enough weeks now understanding this man to know exactly what duty demanded of him, and because she had promised him back in her father's study a lifetime of scandal ago that she would be his partner rather than a woman who needed shielding from difficult truths. "I do," Kael confirmed, setting down the wine, already mentally cataloging the logistics of the campaign ahead, which units were closest to the border, which supply lines would need reinforcing, how quickly he could mobilize without leaving the capital's own defenses dangerously thin. "I'm sorry. This isn't how either of us imagined this day ending." "Don't apologize for being needed, General," Seraphine said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the same steady clarity that had carried her through the worst weeks of her life. "I married a war hero. I think I understood, going in, that this might be part of the arrangement." But she did not intend to simply wait behind palace walls while he rode north, wringing her hands over a war she had no hand in shaping. In the weeks that followed, weeks that stretched eventually into 2 difficult months of campaign and negotiation along the contested border. Seraphine threw herself into the considerable political work required to keep the empire's fractured court united behind the war effort. Using every lesson learned from 3 weeks of navigating House Reynard's schemes to instead marshal the capital's resources, supply chains, and noble houses toward a single coordinated purpose, she discovered in the process a talent for exactly the kind of strategic maneuvering that had once been used against her, except now wielded in service of protecting her husband's soldiers rather than destroying an innocent house. It felt less like the poison it had been in Ophelia Reynard's hands, and more like a genuine gift finally given proper purpose. The southern grain routes are secure, she informed the War Council in her husband's absence, 3 weeks into the campaign, having personally negotiated new trade agreements with merchant houses eager to align themselves with House Voss's restored standing. General Draven's forces will have adequate supply lines through the winter, regardless of how long this campaign extends. The council, which had regarded her with cautious skepticism in the campaign's early weeks, a young duchess however capable, stepping into logistics work traditionally handled by seasoned military administrators, found itself gradually, and then completely deferring to her judgment on matters of supply and coordination, impressed by a competence that owed less to noble privilege and considerably more to the hard-won lessons of a woman who had learned, through painful necessity, exactly how the empire's political machinery truly functioned. Kael Draven's campaign against Draveth's forces concluded ultimately not in prolonged bloodshed, but in a negotiated withdrawal. The neighboring kingdom's generals, upon realizing the empire's supply lines, remained fully intact despite the political chaos they'd hoped to exploit. And facing a general whose reputation for decisive, overwhelming strategy preceded him by years, chose retreat over a costly engagement they had little genuine appetite for. When Kael returned to Thessaly 2 months after his hastily interrupted wedding celebration, he found the capital considerably changed from the one he'd left. House Reynard's trial concluded in his absence. Lord Bertrand and Lady Ophelia, sentenced to lifetime exile from the empire's borders, their remaining holdings redistributed among the houses most affected by their fraud. House Voss, meanwhile, had not merely recovered its former standing, but had emerged from the ordeal with considerably greater influence than before, a transformation owed almost entirely to Seraphine's tireless work during the campaign, coordinating logistics that had kept the empire's northern defenses fully supplied through a war fought, while its court still reeled from scandal. "You've built yourself quite a reputation while I was away," Kael observed, finding her in the estate study late on the evening of his return, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, looking every bit as formidable in her own quiet way as any general reviewing a battlefield map. "I had a good teacher," Seraphine said, rising to meet him, and the 2 months of separation fell away in the space between one step and the next. "Though I imagine you have considerably more experience with actual sieges than logistical negotiations with stubborn merchant guilds." "I'm told the merchant guilds are occasionally more difficult to negotiate with than Draveth's generals," Kael said, and there, again, that rare hard-won warmth in his expression that Seraphine had learned over these transformative months was worth considerably more than any easy charm Cassian had ever offered her. "I've missed you more than I anticipated when I rode north." "I missed you too, General," Seraphine said, "though I'll admit running a war effort's logistics kept me considerably too occupied to properly wallow in it." Their reunion, quiet and genuine, in a way the capital's earlier fascination with their scandal-born engagement could never have predicted, marked less an ending than a beginning, the true start of a partnership that had, over the course of a few tumultuous months, transformed from a strategic alliance forged in the wreckage of betrayal into something neither of them had fully anticipated when Kael Draven first walked into Duke Voss's study with a folder of damning documents and an unromantic proposal. Years later, when historians of the Ardain Empire wrote of General Kael Draven and Duchess Seraphine Voss Draven, they would note with some fascination the strange and improbable circumstances of their union, a marriage born not of romance, but of shared enemies and mutual necessity, that had nonetheless grown into one of the empire's most formidable and genuinely devoted partnerships, credited variously with the northern border's lasting peace, several key economic reforms that closed the exact loopholes House Reynard had once exploited, and a court culture that grew gradually less tolerant of the kind of quiet, convenient cruelty that had once nearly destroyed an innocent house for the sake of another family's ambition. Seraphine Voss never forgot the night a prince spoke to her reflection instead of her face, ending 5 years of loyalty over a trade route and a prettier smile. But she came in time. To think of that humiliating night not as the tragedy the capital's gossip had once painted it, but as the moment a different, truer story had finally been allowed to begin. One where she was not a prize to be won or discarded, but a partner whose worth had never actually depended on anyone else's recognition of it at all. She had simply needed, in the end, to discover that for herself.